Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is June 19th. On this day in 1982, what should have been a joyful weekend for Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old Chinese-American man about to get married, ended in violence and tragedy. That night, Vincent was beaten by two white men with a baseball bat outside of a McDonald's in Highland Park, Michigan. 4 days later, he died from his injuries. This, of course, was tragic enough, but what's worse, what is almost inconceivable, in fact, is that the men who killed him never spent a single day behind bars. Today, we're revisiting the murder of Vincent Chin, a case that didn't just devastate a family, but also woke up a generation. It became a flashpoint for the Asian American civil rights movement and remains one of the most sobering examples of justice denied. Let's get started. Vincent Chin was born in Guangzhou, China in 1955, but his story and ultimately his legacy would unfold in the American Midwest. He was adopted as a baby by David and Lily Chin, a Chinese-American couple who settled in Detroit, Michigan. Vincent grew up in a blue-collar city that was once the beating heart of the American auto industry. It was a place where hard work and manufacturing put food on the table and pride in the community. But by the early 1980s, things were changing. The American car industry was in sharp decline, and with that came economic pain, layoffs, and rising anger. Many Detroiters blamed Japanese car makers for stealing American jobs, a belief that was fueled by corporate fear-mongering and racism. Vincent Chin, though, wasn't Japanese. He was Chinese. And he certainly had nothing to do with anybody losing their job. But to a lot of angry Americans at the time, that distinction didn't matter. Despite that toxic backdrop, Vincent had built a promising life. He worked as a draftsman, was well-liked, had a great sense of humor, and loved to dance. His friends described him as upbeat and generous. He was someone you wanted around. And in June of 1982, he was preparing to take the next step in life, getting married. His bachelor party was set for the weekend before the big day. It was going to be a night to just let loose with his friends, celebrate, and look ahead. But he never made it to his wedding. That Saturday night, Vincent and his friends were celebrating at a local strip club called the Fancy Pants Lounge. Also at the club that night were two men. 43-year-old Ronald Ebens, a Chrysler plant supervisor, and his 22-year-old stepson, Michael Nitz. They weren't there to celebrate anything. What happened next would come down to words, cruel ones. Multiple witnesses later testified that Ebens began yelling racist slurs at Vincent. He reportedly blamed him, but really anyone who looked Asian, for the layoffs that were hurting American auto workers. He allegedly shouted, quote, "It's because of you little motherfuckers that we're out of work," end quote. The confrontation escalated quickly. The bouncer stepped in and threw both groups out. But instead of walking away, going home, and sleeping it off, Ebens and Nitz got into their car with a baseball bat and went looking for Vincent. They found him about 20 minutes later outside of a McDonald's just a few blocks away. Vincent was standing with his friends when the two men jumped out of their car. Nitz reportedly held Vincent while Ebens swung the bat, hitting him in the head over and over again. One blow cracked his skull. The next fractured it further. Vincent collapsed onto the pavement as bystanders screamed for help. When paramedics arrived, Vincent was still breathing, but just barely. He slipped into a coma and was rushed to Henry Ford Hospital. 4 days later, on June 23, 1982, Vincent Chin was declared dead. He was just 27 years old. Vincent's death should have led to a very straightforward criminal case. Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But what came next was not justice. In a plea deal, both men were allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge, manslaughter, which, side note, the fact that they left the club, went in, got the baseball bat, and then went looking for Vincent, that shows to me premeditation and intent, but what do I know? In any case, that isn't even the worst of it. Not only did they not even have to stand trial for murder, but in March of '83, the judge handed down a sentence that is just shocking. 3 years probation, a $3,000 fine, and court costs. That was it. Nothing that even remotely matched the gravity of the crime. And this explanation from the judge is somehow even more infuriating. Judge Charles Kaufman explained his decision by saying, quote, "These aren't the kind of men you send to jail. You fit the punishment to the criminal, not the crime," end quote. These words cut deep, not just for Vincent's family, but for Asian Americans across the country. The message was loud and clear. Vincent Chin's life didn't matter as much. Not to the system. As you may imagine, the public outrage was immediate. Protests erupted in cities across the country: New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. Asians of all backgrounds, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipino, Southeast Asian, they all came together in a rare show of unity. Many were protesting for the first time in their lives. Out of that movement came a new wave of activism. The Department of Justice took notice and brought federal civil rights charges against Ebens and Nitz, arguing that Vincent had been targeted for being Asian, which he clearly was. In 1984, a federal jury found Ronald Ebens guilty of violating Chin's civil rights. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But that glimmer of hope and justice didn't last. A federal appeals court later overturned the conviction, citing prosecutorial misconduct, specifically that a witness had been improperly coached. Ebens was retried in 1987, but this time the trial was moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, a city with a much smaller Asian American population. And there, he was acquitted. To this day, neither Ronald Ebens or Michael Nitz has served a single day in prison for murdering Vincent Chin. Vincent's mother, Lily Chin, never stopped fighting. After her son's murder, she became an unlikely activist. She was grieving and furious, but she was determined that her son's death would not be forgotten. She traveled the country, spoke at universities, rallied crowds, and appeared before Congress. Her message was simple: if we don't speak up now, it will happen again. And in many ways, she was right. The injustice of Vincent Chin's murder and the failure to hold his killers accountable galvanized a new civil rights movement among Asian Americans. Organizations like American Citizens for Justice were born out of that moment. Communities that had long been fractured by language, culture, and nationality found a unifying cause. Vincent's name became a symbol, not just of a life lost, but of a community awakened. His story has been taught in classrooms, memorialized in documentaries like Who Killed Vincent Chin, and honored during rallies against anti-Asian violence, most recently in wake of the attacks fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2022, the 40th anniversary of Vincent Chin's death, communities across the country gathered to remember him and to remind one another that the fight for justice and equity is far from over. On June 19, 1982, Vincent Chin went out with friends to celebrate a new beginning, his upcoming marriage and future filled with possibility. But he was met with hate and ultimately violence that cut that future short. His murder didn't steal just one life, it forced a reckoning and it sparked a movement. And it reminded the world that silence in the face of injustice is not an option. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Vincent's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!